You've got like a system rollout or a new operating model, new policies. These are costly exercises. So a lot of time has already gone into building that business case. Actually, what happens when these things get kicked off is the focus gets directed to timelines, milestones, governance, risk management, delivery plans. And what gets lost is that kind of simple truth that change only happens through people.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Perry, and welcome back to Across the Virtual Table, our podcast where we have real conversations about building capability, confidence, and the gritty reality of ER or employment relations and HR in the modern workplace. Today, we are talking about that dreaded word, change, fresh starts, and the intimate relationship between ER and what organizations need to do to create workplaces where change and dignity go hand in hand, without mentioning my pet hate, the dreaded change curve. With apologies to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. There's a lot of good research that has gone into that. And it is that time of year. It's January 2026. So we will be looking at a little bit of what that means for people when they're going into the new year. And to help me do that, I am delighted to welcome Tara Jones from the Good Change Consultancy. Not only have Tara and I worked on some large-scale projects together, we've also worked on some ER reviews, and more importantly, we've been friends for over 30 years. And I know what you're thinking. We both look far too young to have been friends for 30 years, but it's true. So what we're going to do is we're going to touch on dignity and change in the workplace, the human experience, and in reality, well, what we need is some practical tips and ways of working that people can implement on a day-to-day basis in a large or small organizations, and things that will help to take the sting in the tail out of processes which can be incredibly disruptive. That's enough from me. Tara, can you just do a quick intro and explain who you are and what you do?
Sure. Can't believe it's been 30 years we've known each other. So hi, I'm Tara. For the last decade or so, I've specialized in delivering large complex transformation programs across central government, policing, higher education, the charity sector, and a few major national organizations. So I guess my expertise sits at the point where people, systems, and strategy come together. No surprise, that sits under change management. My role is usually to bring clarity, structure, momentum to programs with really high stakes, with political complexity, lots of independent work streams. And yeah, through my company, the Good Change Consultancy, I basically work with leaders and their teams to help them cut through all of that noise and create alignment, accountability, and momentum.
Thanks, Tara. I mean, there's a huge amount there. So really looking forward to bringing some of that experience into the Across the Table podcast and seeing what we can draw out of that from an ER perspective. So without any further ado, let's get started. And I talked a little bit about dignity at work. And that's something that we have talked about on this podcast and in the newsletter. Really important element of what we do and what we talk about. So can you sort of explain a little bit from your perspective about ignoring the human side of change and the relationship with dignity at work, or how that can potentially undermine dignity at work?
Yeah, so I think when a lot of the time when I come onto large transformation programs, it's treated as a bit of a technical exercise. So, you've got like a system rollout, or you've got a restructure, a new operating model, new processes, new policies, whatever it might be. And these are really costly exercises. So a lot of time has already gone into building that business case. You've had people kind of figuring out, a lot of effort's gone into figuring out the cost of all of this, the resources that are needed, securing funding, all of that kind of stuff. So naturally, what happens, I think, when these kind of things get kicked off is the focus gets directed to timelines, milestones, governance, risk management, delivery plans, all of that. And what gets lost is that kind of simple truth that change only happens through people. And at the end of any transformation program, you're dealing with human beings. So you're dealing with their emotions, with their histories, with their fears, with their motivations. with their relationships. And they're all going to be thinking not only about the opportunities, but also the threats of that change. And like, Joe, how many town halls have all of us in the industry sat in on where you've got a leader giving weak platitudes, not answering any questions, promising staff are going to be supported, but not being transparent, giving really kind of bullshit business jargon responses to staff, clearly kind of showing distress at something that's changing. And I think when organizations overlook, that humanness, that reality, that's when dignity is the first casualty.
One of the sort of ideas, I suppose, that comes to mind, you talked a little bit about the business case and there's so much work that goes in to these projects up front. But
Yeah.
certainly in the areas and organizations I've worked with, sometimes when it goes wrong, it's that human experience and how people are going to work through and live through these changes isn't really considered. Have you seen organizations that have done it particularly well or particularly badly?
I have experienced both sides of the coin. I think a lot of the time people are just expected to kind of, just get on with it. They're not given, when I've seen it done badly, what's happened is people aren't given any space to kind of process what's happening. And that includes like not being given the space to process the loss or the uncertainty or the kind of acknowledgement that some things that they have valued, whether rightly or wrongly, is changing. When I've seen it done well, organizations have built in time to have those conversations. They've built in like really meaningful training and support, and they've acknowledged that something familiar is going to be lost and is changing.
And I mean, some of that goes to the one of the buzzwords in anything that resembles change or transformation or how we describe it, which is change resistance and I suppose also change fatigue, which is another one that we hear a lot about. It's a bit of a buzzword. What does meaningful involvement actually look like in complex change?
So the phrase change resistance actually really gives me the ick. Because people don't resist change because they don't want like progress. I think people resist change because they don't understand it, they don't trust it, they can't see where they're going to fit into it because it's not been explained to them properly. Also, one of my biggest bugbears is when people think the solution is, oh, let's just do a bit of comms. Um, if I was paid every time I heard someone say, "Oh, can we just comms that?" I'd be able to retire now. And it's just such a mediocre approach. I think yes, communication is absolutely important. Of course it is. But you don't get dignity at work from a fancy slide deck or from a 28-page FAQ. You get that when people feel seen, when they feel informed, when they're supported, when they can kind of retain their sense of competence as well and not feel like something's being done to them, when they feel like they've been involved in the process. And I think the other thing that kind of gets lost in the conversation is the real success of any transformation program isn't actually the kind of the rollout, let's say, of a new technology or a new process or a new policy. The real success is the change in behavior that new technology or the new policy is going to enable. And you're only going to get those new behaviors and people coming to the table when their kind of emotional responses are legitimized and when they can process what's happening and they can be part of the conversation. That's when you're going to get the positive behaviors of people. Yeah, they might not like the change, but they're going to respect it and they're going to probably be a lot more constructive with it.
One of the areas that we've talked about a lot in the newsletter and a little bit on the podcast is employee voice, trade unions, involvement. And I think that's a really interesting concept that you've just sort of talked about there about legitimizing people's views, people's involvement. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that feels quite fundamental to any successful change.
Yeah, I think having a kind of a more human-centered approach to it all, like creating space for people to make sense of it all, for people to kind of ask the really hard questions, to acknowledge that things are changing, to acknowledge it's going to be hard, and just also just some honesty about the unknowns, like just saying, look, there's stuff that we don't know, but let's figure it out together, rather than pretending you have all the answers, which is what I see a lot of as well. And look, people see through that. They're not stupid. And I think treating your people like they're human beings, like they're intelligent, that they know their job, creating those kind of safe spaces for those conversations to happen actually ends up reducing a lot of the friction that we end up seeing, particularly in unionized organizations. I've worked in heavily unionized organizations as well, where large complex change is being implemented. And when I've seen it done really badly, it's because there's been lack of clarity. It's led to confusion, misinformation, unnecessary stress, and all of that impacts dignity at work.
One of the things that is a requirement, I suppose, for some of this is a clear plan and
Yeah.
a really good understanding of the organization, the strategy. How important is that as a sort of underpinning element for then what goes on to impact dignity at work in change?
Yeah, I think having a really clear plan is important, but even before that, before you get to the planning, being really clear about the outcomes that you want this change to have is far more important than the plan. The plan has to be informed by knowing what outcomes you want and why those outcomes are key to the success of the organization. And that means having really, really hard conversations up front, being honest about what you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it, what you need to let go of as well in the meantime. And I think also understanding that if you're expecting people to do their day job alongside all of this other stuff around them changing, you've got to make space for that. So you have to have the right people involved in the change program. You have to have the right stakeholder management happening, the right conversations with the right people at the right time. I personally think that all of that foundational stuff is actually more important than the delivery plan.
We'll come on to talk about leaders in a minute, but those hard conversations and everything that comes from that, have you seen people who have done that really well?
I have seen it done really well. I've seen leaders who have been really honest when they've been asked those hard questions and said, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but let's talk about it. And that's, for me, that's really powerful.
And what was the impact of that?
It built trust, instantly made people feel that they were part of the conversation, that they could help kind of shape it all, that they could input to it because they were being treated as adults.
And I suppose sort of just moving on this theme around leaders. I mean, I love a metaphor, and I've talked about Alice in Wonderland in other projects. There's this bit in the book where Alice gets to a fork in the road, and the Cheshire Cat appears, and she says to the Cheshire Cat, "Which way shall I go?" And the Cheshire Cat says, "Well, it depends where you want to get to." And there's a real sort of point in there around that. What are the outcomes that you want will depend on how you approach it. But also, continuing my Alice in Wonderland theme, there's the sort of Mad Hatter, always running around, never has enough time. And you've talked a bit about actually creating space. And I know that the work that you do is about helping leaders to pause, to create the time to be able to have those conversations. And workplaces are becoming increasingly high pressure. The demands on organizations in the public and the private sector just keep piling on. So, what do you think is really important in that space?
So the Mad Hatter analogy is a really good one. I've worked with a few of those. I think what happens is a lot of the organizations that I work with, particularly when there's really difficult, complex change going on, is they're operating at this kind of, they're in constant firefighting mode. They're in constant delivery mode, and they're just kind of falling from one issue to the next. And that's that kind of state of constant urgency where you can't get off the hamster wheel. It's impossible to think clearly and to kind of help your team feel heard as well. Everything just feels rushed and reactive. So I think that's also where you see a lot of erosion of dignity. And a lot of the work that I do with leaders is, I fight really hard to kind of create psychologically safe spaces for leaders and their teams to step out of that constant state of urgency and to be able to reflect honestly about, you know, what needs to happen with purpose, kind of really reflecting on what's going on, mm, and getting to the solutions together. And I'll be honest with you, that the immediate reaction is that it feels like a bit of an indulgence to do that when everything's on fire. But from a dignity perspective, that pause really, really matters because it just allows people to be human and it surfaces the questions that no one's had time to ask and everyone's just fighting, but fighting separately instead of kind of fighting the same good fight together. And having that kind of, time for reflection, for a bit of compassionate challenge is where you can kind of get to the meaningful actions that they need rather than constant firefighting.
I've witnessed this so many times
I'm
in
sure.
I've talked about this a lot, I think, in organizations. Everyone loves a crisis.
Yes.
I think, and what that is, so I'd be interested in your view. I think the crisis creates a clear goal and it gives people a deadline.
Yeah.
And then everyone piles on, they deal with it. And then afterwards, there's this big adrenaline endorphin high of, we had a problem, we solved it, we come together, we're great in a crisis. And then it all goes away. Monday morning rolls around, it's back to BAU, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
boring. And then there is this cycle. Then there's another
Yeah.
crisis. We all come together, we're great. And then you go back to BAU, invoices aren't being paid, clients aren't happy, whatever it is, until there's a crisis. What
Yeah.
do you think? Why is it? Why do organizations and leadership teams get into that cycle?
It's such a good question. I see it all the time. And you're right. People love a crisis. And I think a crisis kind of it helps it kind of brings out the heroes, doesn't it? Everyone feels like a hero because they've helped to solve a crisis, right? It's human nature. It gives them something to talk about. It makes them feel important. It makes them feel valued. They've contributed to something really, really important. And the BAU often is boring. It is the mundane, shitty stuff that no one wants to do, but it's the stuff that keeps things going. It make it helps pay them their wages. So it's just as important. And I think also I think what also happens in the BAU and what I've observed is so much of change happens through relationships. And often many relationships are they're fractured or they're not strong enough. Um and that's where you get a lot of gaps in the BAU because of those those teams that don't talk to each other, the teams that kind of are always clashing with each other because they've got massive dependencies on each other, but no one's having the right conversations. In a crisis, they just have to park all of that and come together because they have to fix something. And actually, what would be great is if you could take the approach that teams have during a crisis and apply it to BAU, happy days.
Another great example of that was COVID.
Yeah.
And it was a challenge out of the blue. No one knew what was going on.
Yeah.
Certainly in trade union sort of environments, all of a sudden people were meeting with trade union reps every day, sometimes more than once a day. And people had to get on with it. And those relationships, where you had strong relationships, they continued to deal with COVID very well. Where there weren't strong relationships, they built them. And I think,
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of organizations, those relationships haven't been sustained. And so
Yeah.
as a result, there's now more conflict. I suppose one of the concepts that you just talked about, which might help with this normalization of crisis mode, is compassionate challenge. I had to write it down. Could you talk a little bit more about that and maybe an example of where you've seen it?
So in the workshops that I do with leaders and their teams, a lot of that is about compassionate challenge in reaching the right kind of decisions. It's just questions. There's nothing kind of politically charged about it. It's just asking, like, are we really sure these are the right problems that we should be solving? Are we really sure that we've got the right skills and capabilities within the team to solve these problems? Are we really sure this is the right timing? It's just, it's really, really listening and asking the right questions to help them reach the right answer themselves.
I think you're underplaying your own involvement, saying it's just questions.
It's the right questions, isn't it?
So can you give us a little bit more about how you help people to come to those right questions?
That's a really hard question. It is just about understanding the wider context. Often when there's a change program going on, and you talked about the delivery plan, it's sort of very milestone set. And what ends up happening a lot of the time is there's not a lot of consideration given to like the wider ecosystem of all of the things that get affected by that change. And when you don't consider the kind of how is this change going to impact that team over there, or that organization over there, or that policy over there, if you don't consider the whole, you end up with lots of gaps. And the work that I do with leaders is addressing the gaps. So it's actually looking at everything. So not just we're going from A to B, and these are the steps that we're going to take, but in going from A to B, who are the people that we need to look after? What are the processes that need to change? How are we going to change them in a way that's not going to disrupt day-to-day operations? Who do we need to train? Who do we need to have to get on board and support us? Who do we need to sponsor it? Who's going to challenge us and who's going to block us? And who do we need to sit down and just have a good conversation with? And it's kind of surfacing all of those things so that you overlay your delivery plan with all of those as well.
Like anything, if it was easy, everyone would be
Yeah,
doing it.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So, considering it's January 2026, some people will be making New Year's resolutions. I saw some research and I listened to a podcast by Freakonomics, which we'll include in the show notes, about fresh starts. And January is clearly one of those times when people look to the future, say, right, I'm never going to have a Whisper chocolate bar again. But I suppose your experience and what you've seen, what practical things can leaders do to honor the human experience without slowing down delivery? Because that is one of the key issues I hear a lot, is the pressure to keep delivering is massive.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, do you know what? I do think it's a bit of a myth that honoring the human side of change slows down delivery. Actually, in reality, it can speed it up. And there's a few things that leaders can do to prioritize that. So the first is kind of making time together as a team to think rather than just updating. So creating space to ask the stuff that I spoke about earlier, like, are we solving the right problem? Who needs to be involved? What assumptions are we making? What decisions are we avoiding? And I think when leaders kind of spend that time together up front with their team, with the right people in the room, what they're actually going to do is reduce rework, reduce confusion, and ultimately kind of get to better, faster decisions together. Not necessarily because everyone agrees, but because everyone's just clearer on the goals and the outcomes.
I really like that. What decisions are we avoiding? What questions are we not talking about? It's about what's not happening rather than the constant focus on the plan and what is happening, or
Yeah,
miles.
completely. And also what do we need to say no to make space for this change? I think also there's something around being really clear about what's changing and what isn't going to change. Kind of naming the loss, as well as, I think what often happens is people talk about this utopia, the future, and they don't actually recognize the loss. And in kind of rushing to sell all of the benefits, you're sort of missing the fact that you've got people at the end of this change program that are going to have to change how they, their routines are going to change, how the people who they speak to, the people who they sit with are going to change. And so I think naming that loss isn't about derailing anything. It's just about it's about preserving dignity, I think.
Again, these things are difficult, and that's why people don't do it. But I really love that idea of, that process of how you get to
Yeah.
those points, and the work that you do sounds fantastic. And not to undermine any of that, and continuing our little theme of January and new starts, the sort of one thing that you would encourage organizations to think about that they could change on a Monday morning, not necessarily in January, but at any point in the year? What's the sort of quick things that might make a difference?
So I would say one quick thing is cut out one status update and replace it with a conversation, the hard conversation. So rather than going around the room and asking people to kind of relay their to-do list for the day, we're all adults, we know what we have to do. Maybe go around the room instead and ask, who is the one person we all need to have a conversation with this week to make sure we're not derailing anything, or who's the one person we know is struggling with this change and needs to sit down with one of us. Just ask the hard questions.
It's a really good one. I've never seen that done, but I think that that work in a lot of the organizations and the projects that I've worked on, and maybe getting rid of one of those, at least one of those slides with the status updates on it, with a rag status, the number of times I've had update. But actually, what are we talking about here? Rather than just repeatedly ticking these boxes.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. Well, look, that brings us to the end of the podcast. It's January 2026. Tara, I don't know, have you got a New Year's resolution that you're going to try and stick to for the coming year?
No, I don't make resolutions because they're just made to be broken, aren't they? So no, I haven't got I wouldn't say a resolution. I think my kind of running theme is always better conversations.
Well, I think that sort of sums it up nicely in that, it's not a single thing that you can just do on January the 1st. There's a whole system of stuff that needs to change behind it, and it's people, and it's complex. So it's never going to be easy. But that's it from us. And the wrap on the relationship between ER and change, probably an area, I think, from an ER perspective that isn't considered enough and is absolutely vital to people's experience of work. Particularly want to thank Tara for taking the time to speak to us and sharing her insights and experience. And there's a huge amount in there when you start to look at my own notes around psychological safety, purpose, which we didn't even really get a chance to talk about, and this how you do compassionate challenge in the workplace. And I think that was a fantastic idea for how that can be really practically implemented, because this is an area where, let's face it, there is a lot of bullshit and there's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of false starts. You can find more out about Tara if you're interested on LinkedIn. We'll also include links and information on all of the areas we discussed in the show, including the website for the Good Change Consultancy, where you can also get in touch with Tara. We're aiming to build something which is practical and useful for HR practitioners and managers alike, and it really helps if you hit the subscribe button so that you get the latest podcasts as soon as they come out. You can also subscribe to the newsletter that we do on Substack. But for now, thank you very much for listening to Across the Table, and we're looking forward to continuing practical conversations, helping to build trust, resolve issues. Thank you for listening to Across the Table. Look forward to continuing practical conversations, helping to build trust, resolve issues, and ultimately improve the experience of work for everyone. Have a good 2026. Thank you very much.